Welcome to ESSA TV. Danielle Wood is the Budget Policy and Institutional Reform Program Director at the Grattan Institute. Danielle's main research interests are tax and budget policy, intergenerational inequality, and economic and political institutions. Danielle is also the National Chair of the Women in Economics Network, and she sits on the Central Council for the Economic Society of Australia. Ms. Wood, thank you so much for joining us today. So our first question, could you please give us a brief overview of your academic and professional experience and some of the past research you've done in your field?
Yeah, sure. There's been a lot of it. So look, I'm sort of a microeconomist is my training, and I started my career at the Productivity Commission because I was interested in policy. And I got to work on a very diverse range of issues while I was there. So I worked on looking at the way we price road and rail freight infrastructure. I did a project looking at health spending, and particularly how advances in medical technology feed into growth in health spending. I looked at the way we regulate gas pipelines. I looked at the vocational education and training sector. So I worked across a really diverse range of policy there. And then from there I went on to the ACCC because I was really interested in kind of competition and consumer issues. And I worked in the mergers area there, so essentially assessing whether mergers are going to impact on competition in the economy. I worked in their economics team, so the ACCC has a little internal economic consulting unit, so I worked in that for a while. And then I also worked for a private sector economic consulting firm specialising in competition and regulation.
Wow.
And then from there I came to Grattan, and here I do tax policy, budget policy, and looking at sort of economic and political institutions and how we could reform those. So I've done quite a number of different sort of big research projects. Done some on tax, so things like looking at negative gearing and capital gains tax. Done a project on the GST and whether that should be increased or broadened. Done a project on superannuation tax concessions. And I've recently done a new piece looking at how political donations, lobbying impacts the policy making process and whether we have the regulatory settings around those things right. So it's very diverse.
Yeah. How do you become interested in policy, especially and specifically in tax and budget policy? But also assuming based on what you said that you have a very diverse range of background coming from different sectors, you can understand the budget in its diversity.
Yeah, that's true. So in terms of how I got interested in policy, I think I actually was interested right back from even high school. So I was one of those people that had a really fantastic high school economics teacher.
You were one of the lucky ones.
Yeah, I was one of the lucky. So I mean, I think that's right. If you have a good teacher, you get really inspired. And I remember she said, the most powerful person in the country is not the Prime Minister, it's the head of the Reserve Bank and the head of the Productivity Commission. And I thought, gosh, I'm not sure I agree with that now. With more of it. It was deep, but I thought, isn't it incredible that these people that most of the population haven't heard of are wielding all this power? So I was sort of intrigued by that. But then I think also, I had a sort of an altruistic bent, and I was sort of more motivated by trying to do the sort of work that would make a difference. So that sort of naturally sort of took me on the course to a public policy career. I think my interest in tax and budget policy came a bit later. And it wasn't actually something I spent much time thinking about until I started working at Grattan. But now, it's obviously incredibly important for economic performance, so it really makes a big difference for productivity. Also has a huge impact on equality. So distributional questions are really at the heart of it as well. And it has a big impact on sort of intergenerational questions. So to me, tax and budget is an extremely important area of policy that touches all of our lives. So I think, it's pretty easy to get excited about that.
Yes, that's really true, and especially that it affects the common Australian.
Yeah, that's right. Everyone on the street, even if they're not aware of it, they're interacting with it every day.
That is very true. Can you tell us about some of your ongoing work, especially in equality? You mentioned before that previous research you've done is based on how to look at how politicians and different organizations lobby the politicians and how that affects the way they make decisions.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, that piece, absolutely, well, those sort of settings control how much influence different groups have. So what we were looking at in that report was, is it the case that certain groups, whether it be kind of powerful businesses or unions, get a disproportionate say in the policy making process? And of course, in a world where the groups with the most resources and the best connections get more sway over decision makers, then you're going to end up with higher inequality. It's almost inevitable that that's the path that it takes you down. So we were looking, from that project, we were actually focused on how do we get better decision making, but a side effect of that, I suppose, is that there would be an impact on inequality. The other work I've done in the inequality space is around intergenerational inequality, which is essentially looking at how different generations are faring at the same point in their lives. And what we're really finding, we've done previous work, we're doing some more work at the moment, is that today's young people may well be the first generation in living memory where we don't see the sort of progress in living standards that we'd expect to see generation on generation. So in terms of their wealth, for example, older Australians have been growing their wealth very significantly over the past decade. For younger people, wealth has stagnated during that time. And there's a growing story about incomes as well. So last time we looked at this back in 2014, we said, well, incomes are still growing. So yes, there's the wealth divide between the old and the young, but we see everyone's incomes growing, so perhaps things aren't so bad. Since that time, we've had an extended period of wage stagnation in this country, and what's happening here is now mirroring what's happened overseas, which is when wages are stagnant across the board, young people are particularly affected. So we see that in terms of income progression, people in their 20s are now really not any better off compared to people with that same age 10 years ago. So that kind of generation on generation progress seems to have stalled. And the other part of that picture is to what extent government policy settings are feeding into this. So they feed into the wealth disparities because of impacts in the housing market, and housing wealth has been a key driver of that wealth disparity. But they also feed in through the tax and transfer system. And we've had kind of a series of tax changes that have been introduced, mainly during the mining boom when we had lots of revenue, that are essentially very generous towards older Australians. And it's working age Australians that are essentially picking up the tab for those at the moment. So I think those policy settings really feed into the differences in generational outcomes that we're seeing.
Yes, and particularly it's interesting that you think that young Australians feel the burden now more than what they used to feel it a few years ago, like 5 years ago or 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. And that really, so one of the theories of why that is, because this is something that's been really quite stark in the US and the UK, where they've had wage stagnation for much longer. And the theory is that often when you're in your 20s, that's the time in your career when you can expect the fastest progression. So you've just entered the job, you might be a graduate, and you might expect a few promotions in that first decade. If you're hitting the jobs market when wages are stagnant, you might miss out on what you would normally expect would be that progression. And so you're coming out at the end of your 20s at a lower base than someone that hit the job market when the times were good and incomes were growing more quickly. So that's the theory about the mechanism by which it occurs. So really, the best thing that could happen for young people is that wages growth picks up across the economy. And certainly a lot of economists are thinking that will happen. But the overseas experience tells us that you can have a very long period of stagnant wages even when labour market conditions are tight.
Do you think that these symptoms will play a role in the next coming election?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually think there will be some political effect, because I think when you look at the policies of the two major parties, there's quite a distinction in terms of the generational impact. And the Labor Party in particular has been quite savvy, I think, at tapping into some of the disadvantages and the negative sentiment of young people. So if you look at their policy around capital gains tax and negative gearing, they're selling that as a housing affordability solution. In our minds, it will help housing affordability, but it's not going to be a silver bullet. It's going to have a modest downward impact on prices. But you can imagine, young people that have been trying to get into the market see themselves losing out to investors at auctions. I think that's a policy that they find particularly compelling. The other thing the Labor Party is doing is winding back some of those more generous tax concessions to older Australians. And they've particularly got a policy around ending the refundability of franking credits. And that's quite a significant revenue raiser for them. Very unpopular with better off older Australians that are going to, they're mainly the ones that are going to lose from that. But that money will be used to put hopefully will be used to put the budget on a more sustainable basis.
These are really good insights to know what is going to play ahead in the next coming years. The Grattan Institute defines Australia as a liberal democracy in a globalised economy. How do you interpret this definition, and how does it shape your work?
Well, so look, I'll take it in two parts. I think the liberal democracy part, what that means to me is that if you want to affect policy change, you need to bring the public with you. So as our job is to advocate for policy changes that we think are in the national interest. And the way we do that is, yes, we go and talk to public servants and politicians and try and say, we think you should do this because of the following reasons. But we also need to talk to the public. So we need to kind of try and capture the hearts and minds and convince the public that these changes are a good idea as well, because democracy, ultimately, they'll be the ones that are casting the verdict on whatever the politicians put forward. So that very much influences our work. The globalised economy point, we are a domestic policy think tank, so we focus on Australian policy. We're not going out there and looking at international relations and all those sort of things, and there are other think tanks that do that. But you can't look at domestic economy considerations in a vacuum. Very much international forces are influencing so many different of the policy areas that we look like. So, if I look at budgets and what's happening in China is going to have a big impact on commodity prices, which feeds directly into the budget bottom line. If we look at company tax policy, one of the key aspects of the debate is if we reduce our company tax rate, just how much will foreign investment increase as a result of that. So there's really a global dimension to what we do when we're thinking about domestic policy.
That's very interesting. The way I'm assuming that the way you play this role is very unique, because we don't see it in most places, because you're in the middle.
Yes, that's right, exactly. Yeah, so that's right. It is quite a unique role, somewhere between. A sort of research university role. We want to have the rigour of that kind of research in what we do, but then we're also got that kind of public facing, trying to sell it.
True. What key skills, what economic or general skills do you need to do your job?
So I would say, in terms of economic skills, I use a lot of second-year microeconomics, I would say. It's incredible, how much it's just those kind of basic economic principles that are sitting behind a lot of the policy analysis we do. But really important to my job is skills around data. So I often actually not doing the data analysis myself anymore, although I've certainly been there. And I have, still not averse to getting down into an Excel spreadsheet, but, looking for the data that will help answer the question, thinking about, precisely what is the question we want the data to answer, and then how do we present the data in a way that will be compelling to ordinary people that might not be used to looking at charts. So that kind of data visualization work to try and tell the story with the data is a really, really important part of what we do. So, I would spend a lot of my day talking with my colleagues about how we interrogate the data, what questions we ask, and then how we present it. So there's lots of really interesting discussions about those things. The other part of this job in particular, well, actually every job I've done, is I think communication skills is incredibly important. If you want to influence policy, you have to be able to win hearts and minds, and to do that, you need to be able to write clearly and tell people why it is that you think the change you're proposing is a good idea. Yes. And you need to be able to sort of speak to different people, you know, not all of whom will be experts in economics. Yes. You need to be able to talk to people that don't necessarily have an economics background, and say it in a way that they're going to find compelling. So I think it's a quite a broad range of skills to work as an economist in a public policy setting. True,
that's really true. I watched your presentation about the 2018 federal budget at the National Press Club in Canberra. It was really good, and
oh, thank you.
you discussed the budget expectations and potential drawbacks. I would like to ask you first, do ordinary Australians not pay enough attention to the budget each year?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I think we can't expect ordinary Australians to engage too much with I think, you know, there's a limit to how interested people are going to be. So I would say two things. I would say, well, actually, Australians are pretty engaged by international standards with economic policy issues, so that's great. I would love to see more engagement amongst young people. Okay. And when, you know, the work that I've done on intergenerational inequality, you know, given how negative some of those settings have been for young people, my only conclusion can be that they're put into place because young people aren't politically engaged. So it's kind of assumed that they're not paying attention. Yes. And therefore, you know, these kind of you know, really unequal outcomes can persist. So I would love to see young people engage a bit more. I think sometimes the coverage of the budget, as well as other economic policy changes, goes too quickly to the question of who wins and who loses. Yes. And, you know, when you'll see it kind of front page of the paper the day the budget comes out, will be, you know, are you a winner or a loser from... I would love, and, you know, it's human nature, we're all going to think about what it means to us, but I would love to see more coverage and then people engaging more with those questions of what it means for the country as a whole, rather than just kind of the individual bottom line perspective.
Well, this is very important to also be aware of like what's happening around your life and what will play ahead. And my second question is, do you find your research interests like tax, budget policy, intergenerational inequality, and economic and political institutions interconnected? And how so?
Yeah, look, I think everything's connected. So look, tax, budget, and intergenerational inequality are kind of inextricably linked. So your tax policy is going to impact on economic outcomes. It's also going to impact on how healthy your budget looks, and budgets. And the budget settings are inherently about transfers between generations. So if you're running a budget deficit today, and that money's not going to fund things like productive infrastructure that are going to give you a return into the future, if you're just using it today to pay the bills, just to, you know, fund your normal welfare and health system and all of those things, inherently you're asking people in the future to pay for today's spending. So it's you know, those things are incredibly strongly linked. The economic and political institutions work is interesting, and I would say in my mind it's just much broader. So I think those settings matter for every single area of policy, which is why I think it's incredibly important. So having good economic institutions gives you the best chance of getting good policy up. So things like the Productivity Commission, I think, is an incredibly important institution in Australia that you know, really does deep evidence-based work and recommends changes that are in the national interest. So that's incredibly important. And then the political institutions matter because they have an impact on who gets heard in the policy debate. So, you know, we find across Grattan, you know, we write about schools policy and health policy and all sorts of things. When you look at why it is that good policy gets put up and then shelved, pushed away, often it's because you have, you know, well-resourced, well-organised interests that are against that change, running hard against it. So the political institutions really go to the heart of how much do those vested interests have control or power or the ear of politicians versus how much are they hearing from other groups. So I think that has implications for tax policy and budget policy, but also every single area of policy, and that's why it matters so much.
That's very interesting. And young people, most of the time, they don't find that really engaging for some reason. And sometimes I don't know why, but do you have your own explanation on why that's not the case for young people?
Look, I think, they've got a lot going on in their lives and they're normally having a good time, hopefully. So maybe they think, politics is boring or not important. And that's why, I spend so much time trying to say, yes, it is. It's incredibly important. And, you should care and you should be engaged, because otherwise, you may well get screwed by the policy settings.
Now, I would like to talk to you about Women in Economics Network and gender inequality in economics. My first question is, how did Women in Economics Network get started? How did it happen?
So it came about, it was actually an initiative of the Economic Society. They had recognised that the economics profession has a gender problem, and they set up it was a mentoring retreat, essentially where 25 women went away for a couple of days. There were some senior mentors there, and the idea was to mentor this small group of women. So I was actually one of the women that attended that retreat, and at the end of it, the mentor sort of said, where, do you want to take this any further? And so myself and a number of other women that were there thought, well, you can't just do this as a one-off. Yeah. We need infrastructure and a group that is actually going to kind of push this issue forward over time. And that was really how the network was born, was just a group of people that didn't know each other beforehand, went away together for a couple of days and then decided from there to start this network. And obviously from there it's grown significantly. We've only been around a couple of years, but we have 500 members. We have committees in every state and territory. So, we have, now it's quite a big and formalised group.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to see it grow. And my second question is, what has been the impact of women in economics since its inception, and how do you measure that impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and how do we measure the impact? Something that we've been thinking about. So look, I think the immediate effect has been connecting women. I think it's certainly clear from my perspective, and many other people give me this feedback. We have a lot of events. We now make that mentoring retreat as an annual thing. Yes. And we've put a lot of emphasis on making sure that we're representing women from government, from academia and the private sector. And that's a really unique and important thing about the network, I think, is that we're bringing together those groups. And that's just a good thing for any economist, right, to be exposed to those different sectors. So I think that's been really advantageous for all the women that have become members or come along to any of our events. So in terms of short-term success, having that big membership base, I think in the first 3 months since we launched the network, women went from being 25% of Economic Society members to 40%. Wow. So we had a really big shift in the gender balance of the Economic Society, where we're part of the Economic Society, so you join the network by becoming a member of the Economic Society and ticking the box. But so that was, I think, a really good outcome. But in the longer term, when I look at how I would measure success, one of the things we've been really pushing on is getting more females in the public debate, so in the media. There was a survey taken a short time before we launched that found that only 9% of people that were cited as economists were women. So that was lower so this is in kind of all forms of media, that was lower than the share of women chairs or CEOs, or it was the worst of any category, was economists. So I would measure success if I saw that number go up substantially. We've not had any female lead any of our major economic agencies. So we've never had a female head of Treasury, we've never had a female head of the RBA, head of the ACCC, head of the Productivity Commission, head of ASIC, head of APRA. It is absolutely, we never had a female treasurer. It's mind-boggling that all of those agencies, the glass ceiling still remains. So there's a lot of great women coming through the ranks, and I would absolutely see it as a success if we saw some more women at the top and we weren't talking about this issue anymore. And I think the final measure of success, and another thing that I've been very passionate about, is actually trying to increase the pipeline of students in general, and then particularly women coming in. We see the numbers of people studying high school economics have been falling over time right across the country, and then within that kind of shrinking pie, the share of women is falling. So we've done a lot. We've produced a video which we distribute through teachers' networks for them to kind of show to their high school classes to say, this is what a career in economics looks like. So it's got lots of real economists talking about their jobs. It's not just about numbers in financial markets, it's about health policy or environmental policy. Exactly, trying to kind of engage and show people that it's interesting and exciting. So the ultimate measure of impact would be to have more students coming through, and particularly more female students coming through.
That's so true, and especially when you said that, first of all, when you said that the lack of representation, and then it reminded me of when I started became more interested in economics, that I saw, I read books like from Robert Shiller or big guys from the US, and I was like, these guys are really clever, and they really explicitly, and they provide good ideas. But it was because I want to be like them. At the end, eventually one day. And if we see more women in the same way, publishing books or being on TV, representing, providing their ideas and policies, women will be more interested in the way, I would like to see play a role in the same way as she does. And also the second thing is that, as you said before, when you started more interested in economics when you were in high school, probably there were young girls as well in high school, they will be potentially interested through the connection to the network. That's really interested.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the role model effect is very real and important. And of course, women can have men role models and vice versa, but we know that the more kind of senior females in the profession, the more women are likely to say, okay, this is something I could do, this is for me. And absolutely, I think, the high school students is, of course you can be an economist and study economics without having done it at high school, but high school is a really important feeder into economics. That's the reason I became an economist, and I know a lot of other people ended up studying economics because they did it in high school and they really enjoyed it.
That's wonderful. My last question before finishing the interview. What is next on the agenda for you as a chair of the Women in Economics Network, and for women in economics overall in 2019? What do you?
Great question. So we've got another ambitious year. So we're going to be ticking over a lot of the things that we do each year, like the mentoring retreat, doing a big push on the women in media space. So we have a media register on our website of women that are willing and able and very competent at going out and talking in the media on particular topics. And there's really a big push across the Australian media to get more women on TV or on radio. So the ABC's doing a big push at the moment to try and increase their female experts coming on and talking in the media. Bloomberg's doing a push. So I really think this is kind of the moment for getting more women out there talking about economics. I think that's really exciting, and I really want to kind of seize that opportunity while it's there. And then I think we're going to be focusing on, offering hopefully many more interesting and exciting events for our members. We're running the Press Club budget panel again. Just hopefully continuing all the good work that we've done.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.